Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Monday, June 21st, 2021. Thanks for tuning into the show. Whether you are watching me here live, I see a couple folks here have just popped in live, or if you're watching the recording of this back on YouTube, thank you for tuning in. This is a live Q&A style show where we answer questions from our users about SaberSim, about DFS, about sports betting, whatever you guys really want to talk about. If you're interested in getting involved and asking some questions and being a part of the conversation, great. That is what we are hoping for. You can ask questions either in YouTube chat if you are watching here live. You can ask questions in our Office Hours channel in Slack. And you can also ask questions for an upcoming show by emailing us, support@sabersim.com. If you want a question answered live here on the show, just ask for it in your email. Otherwise, I'm always picking a few of my favorite questions that come in overnight and over the weekend and things like that to talk about here live on the show. So if you are not in our Slack community and would like to join, there will be a link to this to our Slack community in the description of this video once the recording is posted live on YouTube. That happens every afternoon here, basically as soon as I hop off of the live stream. So pop back over here, grab that link to the Slack community if you want to join. We've got great conversation going on there every day. That's kind of the starting point for a lot of the things we talk about here on stream to start in our Slack community. So I've got a few questions in the queue here today, but as always, if you have anything at all that you'd like me to talk about, it doesn't even really have to be a question, a particular topic that you'd like to hear me kind of talking about a little bit more, really whatever you guys want to talk about, questions, thoughts. We've got 6-game baseball slate tonight. No NBA, which is interesting. Starting to get to that point of the year here in the conference finals now that we are starting to have those days with no NBA coming up. I think we've got a hockey game tonight, a few other things going on. So anyway, I guess without much further ado here, I will get into it. I see some more questions rolling in here. We've got some good ones. I've got 3 or 4 questions to talk about here today. So we will just start knocking these out. Let me pull up SaberSim here. We'll go ahead and get into our first question. Let's see here. All right, cool. We've got our app up, and let me get the first question here. Cool. This one came from Jay. I don't think this was chronologically necessarily the first question, but I wanted to jump on this right off the bat. Was hoping you could touch on how the model looks at the correlation aspect of bats plus starting pitcher, since there is potential for a win bonus for the pitcher, would need the bats to score for that same team. So would be curious to have you chat through this a bit more, pros and cons, when it makes sense, how SaberSim is taking this into consideration, especially when running builds with high correlation and whatever else comes to mind. I think actually also Jay prefaced this by saying, if this has been asked or talked about in an office hours before, just let me know. I saw a couple other notes like that over the weekend here in the office hours channel. You know, we're hosting this every day, and I am totally happy to definitely kind of reiterate and retouch and maybe expand on ideas that have come up before, especially as we get through weeks and months of this show. We are inevitably going to talk about some of the same things twice. If you don't already know, a lot of what I talk about here on this show is actually ending up in our support knowledge base at support.sabersim.com. I'm clipping out segments from this show and using that to fill out our documentation so people can find some of answers to their questions a little bit faster. So as that gets filled out for questions that come in that are a little bit more how-to or instructional, I may at times point questions that then come in office hours that are, how do I do this thing? Or having issues with certain things to our FAQs, but for strategy things or more general questions, I think it's great if we kind of continue to have some running dialogue about these things, can expand on topics and talk about them again. So there are 2 questions like that today, but we'll totally dive back in. So let's talk about this a little bit here. So yeah, you can see some of these correlations. I think Jay, you're totally right on the right spot, right? There is a one particular way in which the starting pitcher of a team is correlated with his own team's batters, and that is in delivering enough runs to create a win, the win bonus for the pitcher, right? And we actually do see that in general, The starting pitcher is going to have fairly minor correlations with most of the batters on his team, right? So we see Urias here does have some minor correlations with the batters, right? Before I really talk into this in detail, I think there's an interesting nuance here, especially when we're talking about things like how SaberSim is taking this into consideration. I just want to note something, especially with things that are correlative and not causative, or right, things that happen alongside each other, where one thing doesn't cause the other. There is always this question, and one of the things that is really cool about SaberSim is we can differentiate between things that are taken into account in the model, right, that have a causative effect on the outcome of the game, like park factors or weather has an impact on the game, right? Correlations between the starting pitcher and the batters is really a manifestation of the scoring structure of DraftKings, right? It so happens that when batters have a good game, it leads to, at least in a somewhat noticeable number of our simulations, that the pitcher gets a win bonus, right? And then DraftKings provides a reward to those pitchers in the form of a bonus. And then we can kind of quantify that, right? So what we're actually really seeing here, when you see some of these simulations, right, is the manifestation of that. And there are small correlations for that reason, right? There's a very fairly subtle, small impact on the scoring structure of contests that leads to batters that do well being slightly correlated with the pitchers, even though there's nothing on the baseball field that would really indicate that, right? That's not something that's written into the model. It's just a matter of the scoring structure of the contest, right? So it's kind of grainy. That's really getting into some nuance there. I think I'm just kind of a nerd for some of this stuff with the correlative factors, but I just think that's one of the things that is really interesting about the fact that this can actually be quantified in the form of a correlation coefficient, even though these players aren't even on the baseball field at the same time, right? And it's a different kind of correlation than some of the very traditional correlations that we see in a lot of DFS sports. But anyway, I'll get off my soapbox in that particular regard. We'll talk about this a little bit. Let me just review this question here. So talk through this a bit more. Pros and cons, when it makes sense, how SaberSim is taking this into consideration, especially when running builds with high correlation. I would say in general, you're going to see with the default settings that correlation that's high or very high-ish. It is not going to be an enormous factor in terms of what actually ends up getting into your lineup. These are pretty small. I think I looked through before I hopped on live here today, and Urias with the Dodgers was one of the larger correlative pitchers with his own batters at 0.05 here-ish, and it doesn't really often get that much bigger than that. So they're very small factors. I would say if you are the kind of player that is pumping your correlation up, especially to something like 9 or 10, it's entirely possible that you may end up seeing some more hitting stacks with the pitcher alongside it, especially if that team is a convenient one to do that with, right? Like Odorizzi, I think, is a pitcher that tonight is going to be fairly popular, probably grades out pretty well point per dollar. And also the Astros are going to be a very chalky hitting stack, right? Those two things may just independently end up being thrown into the same lineup. But if you're pumping your correlation up quite a bit, you may see a little bit more of that. I would say in general, Jay, I don't think this is something that's super important to key in on. I think the biggest thing I would just say to be slightly aware of is if you are pumping correlation up, that is an unintended outcome that could potentially factor into your lineup builds, right? I think in general, we actually don't see, we did some testing with the sliders last week, and it's not as if pumping this all the way up to 10 just gives you 100% 5-3 stacks, right? I think that might be the most intuitive thing that you would expect to happen here. If you want to do something like that, I would say maybe instead use the manual stacking rule instead of pumping correlation up to 10, where you might get some of these game stacks or like full team stacks that include the pitcher. But it is pretty cool, and it's something that we expect, and it's a good like gut check, right? We would expect that there would be this very minor correlation between pitchers and their batters, and there is, and we can see them in our correlation data. So pretty cool there. I guess the last thing I would note here, and there's going to be a lot of there's going to be some noise baked into this, so I'm going to preface this by saying like some of this is a little bit maybe theoretical here. I don't want to say this is the way it is because these correlations are so small that there's some noise here, but we can kind of see that. Trying to think about the best way to say this, right? Pitchers for whom that win bonus is going to be more. Actually, I don't even want to. I'm going to just go ahead and stop it there. As I'm thinking this, I'm already thinking this is going to be a really noisy thing. And as soon as it comes out of my mouth, I don't think it's going to be true. So I'm going to just stop it there. Jay, don't know if you're watching live. Hopefully that helps answer your questions a little bit here. I guess kind of in summary, right? There is a correlation there between pitchers and hitters. We would expect that exactly as you mentioned. It's probably not going to be dramatically factored in to your builds unless you really crank correlation up. And I don't think it's a correlation that is so big that we need to really capture it, right? I think it's pretty minor, and it's well captured in with default settings. So if you have any other questions, don't know if you're watching live, but I'll send you a recording of this after we hop off here, and happy to talk on this more if you have any other specific questions about that. So let's see. Anthony just mentioned in YouTube chat, just started using SaberSim. Think it's a great tool and still a lot more I need to improve on. Yeah, we're happy to have you, Anthony. Keep tuning into these office hours. I do this every weekday, Monday through Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern. As you're getting familiar, if you have questions and things like that, we answer the full range of questions here, from people that are just kind of getting started out and a little unfamiliar, and people that have questions that have been using SaberSim for years. So yeah, keep tuning in. I think done a pretty good job on this show so far answering questions, but we are happy to have you. So let's see. I'm going to go ahead and move us to the next question here. Okay, cool. So this one came in actually last week. This one was from Phantom, another regular, I guess, maybe. A few of you guys have been joining in, asking a lot of questions. It's been great. So, but let's see. He asked, for MLB, do you ever cap player exposure or tend to more adjust stack exposure? Apologies that got addressed in a prior video. Couldn't remember. Doesn't even really matter, right? It's definitely good to reinforce these things and talk about these things over and over again. So I'm going to go ahead. We'll fire up a build, 20 lineup build, default settings. We've been using that a lot for our demos and things like that here on stream. So we'll let this build for a second. We'll talk about this a little bit. But I guess while this is working here, we're still getting started, so I don't need to exactly catch my breath yet. I think, the larger point is, this is really probably more on the side of player preference. I'll talk about a couple specific nuances or things that I think are useful to think about here. But similar to the question of, is it better to cap or is it better to edit projections or better to edit exposures to dial in the actual lineups you want, right? I think this is right on that same line of what makes sense to you. Are you a little bit more comfortable thinking about your exposures of your stacks, or are you more comfortable thinking about individual players? I guess, this was, at least I'm reading this as it being actually directed at me. So me personally, do I ever cap player exposure or tend to more adjust stack exposure? I more often cap player exposure or use player exposures, right? It makes more sense for me to think about, there's a lot of different stack types and there's a lot of different ways to stack a team like Houston. It makes more sense for me to just look at my exposures and see, and you can kind of get useful things out of this, right? Like maybe even in conjunction. So we know we have 100% Houston stack. So every single one of those has Toro. He's one of those guys that's that min price guy that's going to get put into a lot of lineups tonight just because he's going to be point per dollar grading out so well. But then you can see a breakdown of players from there. So I prefer, I mean, ultimately you're putting players into your lineups, right? You're not putting stacks. You don't actually go out and pick teams. You pick players, and the players are what goes into your lineups, and they are what actually score. So it's a little more intuitive for me personally to think about my player exposures and to do my editing from here. But there's nothing wrong with really dialing this in using team stacks. I think you can do some interesting things in conjunction here, especially going in opposite directions here. So saying something like you want 100% Houston stacks. I'm going to set a minimum exposure to just guarantee that you're getting 100% Houston. And you can actually start walking down. I'm going to see how friendly this is going to be with me here. Okay, didn't like that. Let me try something a little more casual and see if that works. Yeah, so you can start walking down some of your individual player exposures while also keeping a minimum exposure to certain stacks, right? So we can set 100 back here again, right? So we're guaranteeing 100 Houston stacks. This would be a pretty condensed strategy, but you can kind of start to see where that breakpoint is, and basically require that the builder be somewhat careful with your overall exposures. I get the feeling that at this point in the day, the builder is just overwhelmingly in love with Houston. So not too bad. So we only have, let's try this. Let me try something a little bit different here. So what we can do is take something like Houston, right? And maybe take all of these players down to like 50%. So we're not too overly exposed to any one Houston batter. Oh, that's not right. But then force a certain amount of overall Houston stacks into our lineups, right? So that's kind of cool. You can use these things in conjunction. That's all I really wanted to demonstrate here. I mean, me personally, I like thinking about players. It's just more natural. Especially I play like every DFS sport there is pretty much. So it's a little bit more natural for me to, look at player exposures when I'm editing things. But that's really a lot of the power here that's baked into our tool, is that you can kind of do these things. You can even push these things in opposite directions all after the initial build has been run, right? We haven't had to build any more lineups. We've dialed in exposures just by selecting some of the lineups that we've already generated here. So cool. So who asked that question? I think that was Phantom. Phantom, let me know if that helps. Again, not sure if you are tuned in live with us here today. I'll get you a recording after this if not. But yeah. Cool. I see some other questions have trickled in here. We'll get to those shortly here. I'm actually going to go ahead and pull one of the questions that have come out of support over the weekend in here. Give me just a second here to grab that question back. I think this question came in from Chase over the weekend in our support channels. I see a few more people have trickled into our stream here again today too. So as I mentioned before, if you have questions and are interested in getting something answered here about SaberSim or DFS, feel free to pop questions into YouTube chat or into Slack in our Office Hours channel. And of course, if you prefer email, you can always email us, support@sabersim.com, and we'll talk about your questions here. So let's go ahead. Okay, let me pull this question back up. So I was a little unsure of the actual kind of intention about this question, so I'm going to answer it in two different ways here. But the question was, when a player's projected ownership is, say, 18%, and I have 4% ownership to him, is that a big enough difference to where research was needed? I read this two different ways. I wasn't sure exactly if this was more about exposures, like if you were referring to, I have 4% exposure to this guy and he's going to be 18% owned, or if you, Chase, have your own like custom ownership projections and we're seeing a discrepancy there. So again, not totally sure. I'm going to answer it kind of in both ways. Let me just edit projections here so we can get this message to go away. But I guess thinking about it in terms of exposure, this is an interesting question, and we get this sometimes, especially about some of these players that are closer to the back half of your exposures, right? So let's see, we'll look at it for the batters, right? But like guys like this, right, where maybe right now we're expecting the Brewers to be a fairly chalky team. And we've got some of these guys that are at 5%. And I think a common trend in DFS, or at least a question that we hear pretty often, is should I just cut those guys out of my lineup, right? I only have one lineup, or I only have 5% of my lineups and they're going to be 20% owned. Should I just cut them out? I think really the point here isn't, is it right or wrong to do that? It's again kind of a risk versus upside type question, right? By removing some of these players at 5% exposure, right? You have to have some players that are only going to show up in a couple of your lineups, and by crossing a lot of these guys off your list, you're essentially condensing your pool. It's going to expose you to a little bit more risk. You'll capture probably a little bit more potential upside in your lineups, maybe, or at least have the opportunity to capitalize on the tighter pool a little more consistently, but you're going to be exposed to more risk, right? This effect of having these guys that are only in one lineup smooths out your ranges of outcomes overall across a single night of DFS, right? It's also completely fine to be underweight on guys. That's probably the way that this question comes in most commonly, especially when we're talking about like a really chalky guy, or in basketball. I think it's really popular too. Like, say LeBron's going to be really chalky, right? And he's going to be 40% owned on an 8-game slate or something like that. And you have 5% of them. And I think a lot of times folks look at that and say, well, should I just cross him off, right? Like, I'm taking a stand on LeBron already. I'm so underweight. Should I just cross him off? And the stand is still made when you're underweight on a player, right? In that particular case, if LeBron fails and 40% of lineups are then sunk, only 5% of your lineups are sunk, right? You still have leverage on the field in that way. And you can still take these moderate approaches to certain players in terms of where your leverage is and how exposed you are to a certain player. So coming around full circle here, I like looking at the question, is that a big enough difference to where research is needed? I mean, I think it can be a signal to you potentially that if a player is projected highly owned and you are underweight on them, that maybe it is something to look at and to at least be conscious of in your build. It would be something that, to me personally, I would want to be maybe somewhat intentional about, that I would at least want to know that was kind of the texture of my lineups that night, that I was maybe getting leverage on the field by fading some of those high-owned plays. Again, this works better, I think, with a basketball analogy than baseball, because especially on the hitting side, we're really thinking about stacks. But I don't necessarily think it needs to be a signal to you that more research is needed, because definitely, I mean, the goal of a slate is not necessarily that we match up to projected ownership across the board, right? Because then if our projected ownership numbers were exactly right, we would have no leverage on the field. So I would say that's mostly just a thing to be conscious of. I don't think there's anything. I think you can, again, tighten up your player pool by maybe removing some of those players that you are only very lightly exposed to if you want, but it can be hard to get rid of them completely, right? Because we have to have some lineups, right? When our smart diversity is high, we have to have some lineups where we just have a one-off guy, or maybe we have a single, let's see, I'm sure we have a stack. Yeah, we have a single Dodger stack. We have a single Ranger stack, right? We're going to have lineups where we just have one guy, or just a few, just 5% of our lineups have those guys in there. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think I've kind of made this clear enough here. I'll talk about maybe the other direction I took this question, just in case I misinterpreted it. Assuming, I guess, that the question here is more about custom ownership. And this is more of something where SaberSim is projected at 18%, and maybe you do your own ownership projections and you have 4% ownership on that player. That to me at least resonates more with the part of, is that a big enough difference to where research is needed? I would say, that probably depends a lot on the slate. It's a good idea probably to get an idea of what the highest owned players look like, right? that might be like a minor or a moderate signal to me on a 6-game slate like tonight that you might want to check. Maybe check signals like Vegas or some other sources if you have those available to you to see how that player maybe is being projected in his ownership around the rest of the industry. You could always meet in the middle between those two values. On a 15-game slate or something like that, maybe a player that's 18% owned, especially a hitter, might be the chalkiest player on the slate, where this impact would be significantly greater, right? You might be under projecting the ownership on a player that's actually going to be very chalky compared to the rest of the slate on a big slate. Likewise, on a small slate, there's probably not even a single batter that would be just projected for 4% owned, but a difference of 14% may be actually not a very big impact on a small slate. So I would say taking this question more as a question about having a big discrepancy between your own custom ownerships and SaberSim's projected ownership, I would say, again, similar to how we have all these conversations about discrepancies between SaberSim and other sources and things like Vegas, right? Pull in other sources where you can, use your priors, use your understanding, your prior knowledge about the teams and the players playing and adjust appropriately. I think if you land somewhere in between those two, you probably just fine. So hopefully, depending on whichever way that question was intended to be asked, hopefully that helps answer the question. So Chase, again, I'm not sure if you're watching live here. If you are, welcome. And otherwise, I'll get you a recording as soon as we're done. So let's see. I see a few other questions have trickled in here. I'm gonna jump to this one here. This is a question from Jack. It's a great question. This came in right at the start of the show here. Disadvantages of maxing out smart diversity. Seems to me like a maxed out smart diversity slider would be preferred for big top heavy contests. That is definitely true. Right. So what smart diversity is going to do, I see we've got a fairly big crowd here today. So that's great. Maybe a few newcomers to our office hours show. So I'm going to start here by saying what smart diversity is doing is the higher this smart diversity slider goes, we are using a smaller subset of our game simulations to determine every player's individual projections when deciding if they get put into a lineup, right? So kind of confusing, right? Maybe at first glance, a lot going on there. What we can see here is if we click on a player like Altuve, we see a real distribution curve of Altuve's ranges of outcomes across the 5,000 or so game simulations we have of his game, right? His projection here in this case is his average outcome, his mean calculated outcome across all of those simulations. The higher smart diversity goes, the smaller the subset of that player's simulations we use to determine his projection for any one given lineup that we are building and then deciding whether or not we want to put that player into the lineup. When smart diversity is maxed out, we have essentially a single game simulation we're using for every single lineup, right? So if smart diversity is at 10, we're going to pick out a single Astros and Orioles game simulation, use the players' scores that they scored in that simulation, then so on for the A's and the Rangers, the Indians and the Cubs, and combine those with the impacts of correlation and ownership fade and build your lineups, right? So the question here is getting at, particularly, I think, Jack is picking up on kind of a little bit of an interesting nuance here, that once we get this smart diversity to 10, there are some impacts of having the smart diversity that high and using a single game simulation. So let's just run a build. I think one thing that's really interesting here, and also a great way to get more familiar with what the sliders are doing, how they're impacting your player pool, how they're impacting your lineups, is to just experiment with builds at the extreme. So I'm going to run a build here. This is Smart Diversity 10. So let's just go ahead. We're going to open this up, see what happens here. And there's a few things I specifically want to note here. First off, I think maybe some of the other nuance here in the question. Jack mentioned a maxed out Smart Diversity slider would be preferred for big top heavy contests. That is absolutely correct. As soon as this build is done, I'll pull back up the defaults and we'll talk a little bit about that. You will see in general that contests that are larger, contests that we interpret to have a more top heavy structure, are going to have a Smart Diversity slider that is higher exactly for that reason, right? So if we are looking at for example, a 20 max that's under 10K, right? We have a moderate Smart Diversity. Whereas maybe the big tournament, I know DraftKings has a $72,005 150 max tonight, right? Right off the bat, it just cranks Smart Diversity up to 10, right? We want that as high as it can go, especially on a 6-game slate. We want to really capture as much upside as we can. I think, the tooltip says at the expense of average performance, right? All the prizes are up top. We want to maximize our EV of our lineups by building lineups that are built with the highest upside possible. You can see also, even if we look at something like a single entry satellite with maybe however many players in it, right? 10,000 players, right? Even a single entry satellite is going to have a very high Smart Diversity. If we start allowing that to be a multi-entry contest, that's going to even crank up higher, right? Satellites, very top heavy contests, typically one or just a couple tickets up top. Those are going to be a little bit higher than their comparable. I guess the point here I'm trying to make, their comparable GPP contest, right? The satellite is going to, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. The satellite is going to be a little bit higher. I keep doing the exact same thing. Sorry. Okay, so typical GPP contest, and then the satellite is going to go up significantly, right? So I mentioned before here on stream that if you were playing an extremely top-heavy contest, right, like probably like something like a Millie Maker, where 40% or 35% of the prizes are going to first place, you can definitely justify starting to use some of these sliders that are more reminiscent of a satellite just because of the payout structure of that contest. So, but anyway, our build is done. Let's talk about this a little bit. So we ran some of these experimental builds. And I guess let's talk about a few particular impacts that you'll see of a build run at 10 Smart Diversity. The first is that your player pool is likely to get quite a bit wider, and your most exposed players are likely to go down quite a bit, right? Whereas a lot of variance, especially in a sport like baseball, that when we take things all the way down to the single game simulation buckets in terms of generating projections, we introduce that variance into our lineup pool. And that's great. That allows us to capture the upside. We're capturing real players' ranges of outcomes, even on Houston, right? Houston is actually, I'm pretty surprised by these distribution curves. They are extremely well projected, but you see a very popular or a very common outcome for all of these Houston batters is scoring under 5 points, which would probably lead to them not being used in the lineup. So you can see this is coming down. So impacts, right? I think Jack really wanted me to talk about the impacts of having Smart Diversity this high. If you are playing, for example, just a handful of lineups into something like a really top-heavy contest where Smart Diversity is really high, we're not seeing it so much here, again, because Houston is projected just so well. But if you are the type of player that likes to maybe throw a handful of lineups into a really big top-heavy contest, and I think the common way players build those lineups is to build kind of a core and rotate a few guys around them. Smart Diversity at 10 may not always play kindly to that, right? Especially even on pitchers, right? Like we have 5 lineups here. We have 6 different pitchers. We're being pretty loose. If you want to tighten up a player core and play that kind of lineup portfolio into a contest like this, you will likely need to do so manually because Smart Diversity being that high while giving you really high upside lineups is not going to give you as much of a tight core. You don't need to go in and do that. You don't need to manually go in and tighten up your core. I think it's totally fine. These are probably still profitable lineups. But if that is kind of the way you like to think about your lineup portfolio, that's something to note. The other thing that is very useful to note is that at Smart Diversity 10, you do sometimes the impacts of correlation and stacking in general become a little bit less important because we're typically going to build a lot of natural stacks on their own. I think maybe also where this, well, I guess just thinking about this, right? If we're taking a certain game simulation and Houston has a ceiling outcome and they score 12 runs, right? It's probably likely that you can pick out 4 or 5 batters on the lineup that had ceiling outcomes individually, and those players end up making their way into the lineup. So not something that, again, I think you need to adjust for necessarily. I wouldn't go and bring your correlation slider down for any reason. I think it's still useful to make sure that the builder is taking into account those correlations. But something, I guess, on Showdown, right? I play some baseball Showdown pretty often, and you'll actually see correlation's going to be just a lot lower in general. I a lot of times will just end up turning this off if my smart diversity is already very high, just because I know that for a single game sample, right, the impacts of correlation are going to be already taken into account by looking at individual game sims. So those are kind of the two things that I thought about. Jack said, or if it, disadvantages is a bad word, maybe things to be aware of if ramping up smart diversity. Those are kind of the two things that popped into my head here. This question came in right when I got started. So let's see. Max also just mentioned something here. I don't know if you mentioned this, but if smart diversity is very, very high, especially the highest setting, your lineups are less likely to be the top equity lineups. Max, I'm interested. Maybe you want to expand on that just a bit. I don't want to misinterpret what you are referring to here. So I'd be interested if you wanted to expand on that a little bit. I'll pull that back up on screen and we can talk a little bit more about that. Top equity lineups. My initial impression here is that kind of the value of Saber score in determining your top lineup drops, but I'm interested to hear what you're referring to in detail there, Max. But Jack, if you're tuned in live here, those are kind of the first things that popped into my head about, things that I would be aware of ramping up smart diversity. Feel free to chime in as well if you have any thoughts on that here, or if anybody else. But those are kind of the things that I would definitely pay attention to. So. Let's see. So another question here. We can come back if there's maybe more thoughts on the smart diversity question here. But for now, I'm going to jump over to Aaron's question here. How do you feel about Xing out the 2-mans and 3-mans on chalky teams? This is an interesting point. So a lot of times how I end up thinking about this, I'm going to pull my build back up here. I think this is a really interesting point, Aaron. Let me again. That was our smart diversity one. Let me pull back our default. Okay, actually, before I jump into this, since Max just responded. So yeah, this is exactly what I was thinking about. This is a good point too. Your number one Saber score lineup might not be your most positive EV lineup if we're building lineups off of one simulation, because that simulation might be too random. That is a great point. Down to the single simulation point here, we introduce a lot more noise and variance here. So especially if you are using the rank fill method in our entry editor, right? And maybe building just a handful of lineups and then using rank to play your best lineup or your theoretically highest Saber score lineup as the first lineup in every entry you're playing, right? Max makes a great point here, right? The higher your smart diversity goes, the less confidence there would be behind that actually being your most positive EV lineup. That's essentially what Saber Score is trying to do, is quantify the impacts of correlation, ownership fade, upside into your lineups into a single number and tell you as the user what your best lineup is. Yeah, I think Max makes a great point here that once that really starts to get high, there's less confidence behind that number. And I did just notice here, this is a little weird. I actually had a user email me about this over the weekend. These are supposed to be standardized here to 100, and I am seeing that on some of these builds they are not. So take a look at that. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and jump back here over to Aaron's question. So what we were talking about here is the idea of, I think he said Xing out 2-man and 3-mans on chalky teams. This is an interesting point. I don't think, and in general, I am not likely to go through and do this intentionally. But I think there is a game theory argument to be made that the best way to use the chalky stacks, if you are going to use them, is in the biggest stacks you can make possible. And the reason why is a element of correlation, right? So if we are playing, for example, I think it's very likely that Houston is going to be the chalky stack tonight, right? And if we are using maybe a lineup that has someone like one of these guys hitting right in the middle of the order, like Michael Brantley or something like that, right? And you have a one-off of that player, or maybe you have a small single Houston stack, right? So we have a 3 stack here of Houston where we've used Alvarez, Brantley, and Gurriel, right? It is better demonstrated thinking about it as a one-off. But if Brantley hits a home run, right, or even just gets on base, right, while that is good for your lineup, by in effect giving every other hitter in the batting order 1/9 of an additional at bat because he didn't get out, other lineups that stacked that team more aggressively stand to gain more from the impacts of correlation than you do, even though you have rostered that player, right? And there are certainly game outcomes where a single player on a popular team goes off, or a minor stack or 2 or 3 players on a popular team all have, you hit the total nuts with Houston, and it's maybe they have a relatively median outcome. They score 6 runs, and Gurriel, Alvarez, and Brantley all homer, right? Like this is probably still a profitable lineup. It shows up with a high Saber score here. It's a highly ranked lineup. I don't think this needs to be intentionally X'd out, but it is an interesting component when you're really diving into the individual lineups here that I think using it again. I think I'll just reiterate what I said before, that the best way to play the chalk, I think, if you are going to play it, especially with stacks, is to max out the largest stack possible, because you take into account that correlative effect. I am a little bit hesitant instead to use single game or single players or minor one-off stacks of those players, because I don't want to enable the ceiling outcome of the players that stack those teams more aggressively than I did. So it is definitely a very interesting thing to think about. I think, like, honestly, tonight is a pretty decent example of a slate. It will be important to keep an eye on, I think, what the field is looking at throughout the day, and how much ownership is apparently going to condense. You know, we always talk about this Fantasy Labs dashboard here that I think is really useful for just quickly visualizing at least what the field perceives about the hitting spots that day. But yeah, I checked this earlier, right? The Astros are kind of running away here with their implied total, at least at this point in the early afternoon. So something important to continue to keep an eye on, right? If the field ends up ultimately believing that the Astros are by far and away the best hitting spot on the night, and that team is getting really chalky on just a 6-game slate, that's where these impacts start to come in. This is a slate where I might consider basically kind of having that approach with a team like Houston. I don't know how much Houston I would be likely to get, period, in a slate like this with how the day is developing. But if I were to roster them, I would probably want to maximize that correlative effect. So Yeah. Aaron said, yeah, that's how I think about it. Yeah, definitely kind of a more like nuanced way of thinking about the correlation and game theory components there, but something to note. So awesome. Cool. I've had some great questions today. We've got a great audience here. So thank you for everybody tuning in here. I see another question rolled in here. This was from Paris. What is your single entry process? This is an interesting question. This comes up fairly often here. And, I guess I'll start here. One thing that's very useful, again, I mentioned this in our sliders episode last week. Last week we had I think it was maybe on Wednesday or Thursday show. We ended up spending most of the day talking about the impacts of sliders here, and some cool things that you can do to look at this. And one of the things that I think is very useful about our sliders in general is they become a bit of a tool to kind of introduce you to different contest types and sport types if you're not entirely sure where to start. So you can see, for example, we kind of almost have quantified here maybe the differences in the way that you would approach a single entry contest of a similar size compared to a 20 max, right? So on the 20 max here, we have correlation at 6, ownership fade 4, smart diversity at 7. And then if we click and look at our single entry, we see certain impacts, minor impacts of what happens to the sliders, right? I'll start at the bottom. Smart diversity comes down just by a tick. We are a little less searching for that massively high upside lineup, right? And a little bit more comfortable having something that's a slightly, very, very slightly more projected towards its medium outcome. In conjunction with that, ownership fade comes down just a tick. And this is because ownership condenses more on single entry contests. When you give players less lineups to build, they typically choose safer plays. You will see the impacts of ownership condensing playing a single entry contest. So our need to fade ownership goes down because fading ownership slightly basically gets you more value in a single entry contest. And finally, correlation goes up. Since our goal in DFS is not to build the optimal lineup, it is to beat all the other players in the contest, we can essentially rely on correlation a little bit more to give us a lineup that has a greater correlated chance of success at the expense of maybe not necessarily building what ends up being the mathematical optimal lineup as much, because again, there's just a single entry. But you can see things have only moved here about 1 point in any direction. So I guess my point here that I will preface this is I push back in general on the idea that there needs to be a dramatically different single entry process. And I would allow the default sliders to kind of guide you in the right direction there. My personal, like speaking of actually how I approach these contests most nights, is I don't really actually take a very different approach to my single entry lineups at all. I will typically do one of two things. I will either be entered into a very wide amount of contests that includes single entries and 3 maxes and 20 maxes and 150 maxes. And especially on a slate, like a bigger slate where maybe I want wider exposures, I want to be more spread out, I will build the actual number of entries I have in terms of lineups. I will find a middle ground set of sliders, and I will use our unique fill in our entry editor to basically randomly assign lineups to different contests. And that really, I feel like, emphasizes that you don't need to be dramatically different in your single entry contests, because I will build lineups sometimes and be happy if they end up in my 150 max or happy if they end up in my single entries. On a night like tonight, where I think their slate it's a 6-gamer, I think there is going to be some very condensed ownership. I am likely to take a very strong stand overall on the slate tonight. Another thing I will typically do is I will still use one build, but instead use our rank fill method. And I will build very intentionally in such a way that I am willing for my number 1 Saber score lineup. So I'll pull a build back up here. Is going to go in every single one of my single entries. So either way, right? I'm using the same build for most of the time, all of my contests that night. I don't think there's anything wrong with splitting it up. I think the sliders will guide you in a direction that will lead you to building lineups that are similar across different contests. There are obviously exceptions, right? If we look at 150 max, like the big $5 knuckleball tonight, right? There's going to be a big difference in terms of the lineups that maybe this slider setting would use compared to like a 100-man or something like that, right? Then we're going to start to see some bigger differences. But I think most of the time, the way this question comes in implies that there needs to be a big difference in your single entry process and your multi-entry process, and there frankly really doesn't need to be. At least that is the way I look at it, right? Like we're looking at the impacts of correlation, we're looking at the impacts of ownership, and we're trying to build lineups with upside. But Paris, if you have any other specific questions about kind of what this looks like, I'm happy to kind of continue to expand there, or if you have a specific contest or anything like that you have some concerns about, maybe your approach, happy to talk a little bit more about that. So let's see. I saw another question come in. This is from Deshaun. We need a unique player setting, please. How many players can be subbed out of the next lineup? We have been hearing this increasingly so. We are working on adding that as a setting. I know that's something a lot of players ask for and would like to see. So we are working on that. I would say I'm going to echo thoughts that Max had here in our PGA DFS strategy session that is now up on YouTube about this exact concept. And note that, if you're looking at this from the purposes of what you are attempting to accomplish by having that setting, you are trying to increase the diversity of your lineups, right? You are trying to avoid a situation where you are overly exposed to a certain lineup construction or player or stack. And smart diversity is going to do that in a way that is smart. It's named that for a reason, out of the box, right? So I would say if you have concerns, I think this exact question came in Slack earlier today from another user. If you have concerns about your diversity of your lineups overall, if your exposures are feeling condensed to you, if your lineups appear to be constructed very similarly at first glance, I would say try another build with smart diversity higher, right? That's going to be the impact of that. You're going to end up with a more spread out player pool. At very high smart diversity settings, I think you're likely to get lineups that are often diversified by more than one player anyway. So that is probably the great place to start, right? And that works by actually looking at our simulation data and taking smaller buckets of simulations from players to build your lineup, right? 2 unique players or 3 unique players per lineup is fine, but it's a heuristic. It's a way of making a lineup optimizer that uses median or mean projections to build lineups do or get closer to a thing that you want to happen, which is spreading out exposures. Smart diversity is going to allow you to do that in a way. This isn't the build I wanted to click. In a way that also brings upside to your lineups. So it is in a way that reflects the way lineups actually win tournaments, which is by capitalizing on that upside. So with all that said, again, I know we've been hearing this, I think, even more and more recently. That is something we are working on and hoping to implement here as part of one of our next few major releases. So I think definitely before NFL season is what we're shooting for on that. But if it's something that you are kind of looking to figure out in the meantime, definitely recommend playing with some higher smart diversity values. And I will say, since we've been talking about smart diversity a lot today, this is, I mentioned it in last week's kind of slider video too. This is definitely a slider that I'm willing to touch, to move around, and I'm often bumping it up. I personally am not very concerned, even if I'm getting up to very high on certain slates. I will definitely move smart diversity up. It's a slider I move quite a bit. I almost never move it down. You are not going to break builds or make unprofitable lineups with a very high level for your smart diversity slider. But yeah, again, I would echo what Max said here too, is that maybe the impact of SaberScore, the reliability or the confidence behind SaberScore may go down because we're just using some of those small buckets of simulations. So cool. We've been a little bit all over today. We've had some great questions coming in. There's been a lot of interconnection and relation between a lot of these questions. Which makes sense. DFS is an interconnected game, right? The correlations of players influence their upside, and the ownership of those players influences the leverage you have on the field. So, but this has been a fun session. Thank you. I mean, for everybody that's had questions and comments and things to offer here. It's been a lot of fun. I don't see too many other questions coming in here. We are getting pretty close. We've got about 5 minutes till. If anyone has any other quick questions, I would say go ahead and fire them off. If I don't feel like I have time to do it justice here, I will talk about it first thing tomorrow in our show. And otherwise, I'll kind of start to wrap up here with a few thoughts. So again, we had a great audience today. I get the feeling maybe that there were some first timers here, at least watching live. So we will be right back at this again tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern. We'll get the link out early so that folks can go ahead and be ready to watch this here and join. If you are interested in being involved in this show, again, I mentioned you can email us, support@sabersim.com. Otherwise, join our Slack community, the link of which will be in the description of this video once it's posted on YouTube. And then let's see, on Thursday, I didn't mention it at the start here, but on Thursday, we typically use this slot for what we were calling a strategy session. So we pull in some other members from the SaberSim team. We've had Max every week, but we've had Danny and Will and Andy and a few other folks here on, and we'll talk about a specific subject or sport or concept or contest type or whatever, and go a little bit deeper into the overall strategy. We'll still take questions, but we like those days to be focused more on a specific topic. So last week we did golf DFS with the US Open going on. We've done some NBA playoff stuff, some esports, some sports betting stuff going on. So I don't think we have an plan for this week at the moment, but we will be doing another one of these on Thursday. So if you have ideas of a concept that you'd like for us to really dive much deeper into, feel free to shout it out. And we'll be doing something for our strategy session on Thursday here. So I do see one other question just kind of trickled in here. And I don't know if this is one that I can exactly do justice on, but I'm going to at least start here. So Big Sub asked about effective entrants. Can you talk about that? That's a little bit of a contest selection buzzword for me here. I've said that a bunch now on stream, but I can talk about that. I will say, first off, I'm going to direct anyone watching this here to please check out under resources and strategy on our actual site, sabersim.com here, under baseball. And then this course, build a winning MLB DFS process. This effective entrance thing, at least I think kind of originates here, or at least a lot of our discussion has come around this particular lesson for bankroll management and contest selection. Andy put this video together. It's 22 minutes of him actually walking through the DraftKings lobby and picking out what he thinks are I mean, he even says it here, literally the exact contests to play to grow your bankroll as fast as possible. Effective entrance is mentioned in this video, and what he is really kind of getting at is, rather than looking at the total number of lineups that are going to be in a contest, to take the number of the total number of lineups divided by the entry limit for any one player, right? And I will actually just go ahead and just pull this up briefly here, and we'll look together at this, right? The idea here is that a contest that has more effective entrants is a softer field, right? Because there is a limited number of extremely skilled players, or even just skilled, right? Or there's a finite number of skilled players in DFS. So the greater number of total entrants that can be involved in a contest, the softer that contest gets, right? So at first glance, something like this $5 knuckleball tonight, 71,000 people in the contest, but it is 150 multi-entry, right? So in actuality, we can take 71,000 people divided by 150 and realize that there are only this contest really only takes 473 people to max it out. Now, will 473 people max it out, right? No, that's not the way the lineup's actually going to be. That's not the way the tournament's actually going to end up being constructed. But the most skilled players are going to be the ones that are maxing it out, right? Sharpshooter, we did this before on one of these office hours, but if you actually go through and start looking at entrants in these contests, you will see that the people that are maxing it out are generally going to be the more skilled players. There's often going to be a lot of name recognition there that's taking place too, of the players that are actually maxing a contest out, or even just have most of the entries in a contest, right? So this has an effective entrance of 473, right? We can compare that with just something like a single entry, right? Like this one. This is actually a pretty cool contest that they're hosting here tonight, this $3 single entry. This single entry has almost 8,000 effective entrants, right? It's a lot easier to imagine the impact of what the skilled player base can do to a contest like this knuckleball, where there are 473 effective entrants, right? 473 people can max it out. Then the impact that the population of skilled DFS players can have on this contest that is almost 8,000 people, right? There just probably aren't 8,000 skilled DFS players that are going to get in this contest. So that's the idea about that. I'm going to cut us off there because I'm jumping over on time here. I would say Big Sub, maybe start there. Let me know if you have any questions about that. Check out that video that Andy put up in our course if you haven't already, because he's got 22 minutes to talk about it here, and I had about 4. And then if there are more follow-up questions about that, we can talk a little bit more about it tomorrow. Contest selection, if you have watched me on here before, I am a contest selection nerd when it comes to DFS. I will talk about contest selection for hours. So I would be happy to talk about this a little bit more in detail tomorrow. For now, I'm going to go ahead and cut it off there. And again, I will see you guys all tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern time. Thank you so much for joining today. Thank you for being a part of this. And we will chat again tomorrow. All right. Cheers.